Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
The giant dragon clan was a powerful and divine race, and it was very dangerous to approach them. But they were also able to fulfill various desires of the human heart, and as soon as the girl who believed in miracles heard these words from her father, she was even more inspired. And so, even from an early age, she began to pray and ask for help because she wanted her dad to come back. She also hoped that these dragons would be able to protect her, just like her father did. The girl always believed in this, so it made things a little easier for her. She also asked them to take away her magical powers, but at that moment she suddenly heard some strange sounds nearby. And as soon as she opened her eyes, she saw a small, incredibly cute dragon in front of her. And now, 10 whole years have passed since that fateful meeting, and the girl has turned into a real lady. She was riding in the carriage and thinking about the conversation that had taken place with her sister before. The girl immediately asked her how long she would have to be gone, and she was told that it would be a long time, since the old lord was in his domain. Of course, everyone understood that marriage was such a hassle, but they had to go through with it. The sister of this beautiful girl said that she should not worry, because even though the old lord was older than her and also ugly, he would still be very generous to her. The sister also explained that he already had 7 wives, but he agreed to make her even the 8th, so this was a very great happiness for them. The girl also remembered how she turned to her mother and wanted to talk to her so that she could come up with another option. She not wanted go out get married for of this long-eared lord. But her mother didn't want to listen to her daughter at all. She even always pulled her hand away from her and just looked at her with disgust. When the girl asked what had happened, the stepmother replied that what she had received was the result of their labors, so she should definitely appreciate what she now had. Pearl, of course, was very surprised by this and did not like it. She began to scream loudly and said that she was only 17 and this man was 50. It was quite obvious that she was not happy with this marriage, but her mother's lover told her to shut up because no one allowed her to open her mouth and say something like that. He shouted at the couple and said that, obviously, she would create a lot of problems for him, and if he didn't teach her a lesson now, it would be too late later. At that moment, he had already swung at the poor girl, but her mother blocked his path and did not let him hit her. Pearl was ready to take the blow at this point. Her whole body was shaking from fear and the sadness she felt because she simply couldn't do anything. However, Mom looked at her lover and said that she wanted to remind him, her value depends on this face. It was only for this reason that she protected her daughter from this beating. And when she looked at the couple, she said that the offer was very profitable. The woman also added that she would be leaving tomorrow, and if she didn't want to, they would simply shove her in by force. No one was going to stand on ceremony with her, that's for sure. But Pearl, at that moment, laughing nervously, replied that she didn't need that. She would go there herself, because she understood perfectly well that if she resisted, it would only get worse. And at that moment, when she was riding with the maid in the carriage, various purple lights suddenly began to appear around her. This energy flew throughout the entire carriage. The maid, seeing this, was very frightened. At first she hid in a corner and trembled all over. When these shadows began to approach her, she was terrified, and opening the door to go out, she realized that she was no longer going to sit in this place and just wait for her death. She certainly did not sign up for this. And as she ran out, she turned to Pearl, calling her a witch, and wished her death. She wanted that young woman burned down alive in his own flames. She wished for the witch with the devil's fire to die in this place, and she believed that she fully deserved it. And at that moment, as the maid ran out into the street along with the rest of the people who accompanied this carriage, they suddenly saw something strange and huge in the sky. Looking more closely, they realized that a huge dragon was approaching them. It was simply gigantic in size, and they immediately realized that it was not kind. People immediately started running away in panic in different directions because they were afraid of something like this. And Pearl at that moment looked out of the window as soon as she heard everyone saying something about a dragon. Pearl was surprised. She didn't understand how a giant dragon could be in this place, and she knew that she needed to run as quickly as possible. But the moment she tried to open the carriage, she realized that it was locked, and no matter what she tried, she could not get out. They were so afraid that she would run away and end up losing so much money that they just went and locked her in that place. Then she remembered that she still had fire, and just as she was about to use these abilities, she suddenly heard a strange sound near her. And at that moment, when Pearl turned her head to the side and looked out the window, she saw the huge eye of the very dragon that all the people around were talking about. This dragon immediately turned to the girl and put her on his tail. He called her his bride. As soon as Pearl heard this, she was very surprised. She looked at him worriedly and asked what he called her. The girl had absolutely no idea what this creature was talking about. She was hysterical, already crying and ready to give up. However, due to the intense shock and stress, the girl simply passed out. Tears were still running down her cheeks, but she no longer knew what would happen next because she simply fell asleep. The dragon, as soon as he saw this, was a little surprised. He did not understand why she fell asleep so quickly. And Pearl at this time remembered her past, about how she was always bullied by different children and her toy was taken away from her. The girl had one favorite doll, and they always took it away, and also bullied and made fun of her because of it. One of the boys asked her if she liked the doll and called her stupid, but the girl said that it was hers, so they had no right to do that. At that moment, the guy moved closer to her and asked what he got out of her being hers. Why, this boy said that it was only because of her pathetic mother, who climbed into his father's bed, that she was able to join their family at all. He called her a pathetic mother and didn't understand how they could have left her alive at all. Other children were also running in front of Carol, pulling her hair and all that stuff. But Pearl couldn't do anything about it. She just had to stand there and wait for it to end. And the little dragon, who was watching her from the side at that moment, noticed that this was a rather boring performance. He also suggested that she did not have divine powers, otherwise she would have used them to protect herself and her honor. He was about to fly away when suddenly the boy noticed something flying above. He assumed it was a bird, but he couldn't understand where it had come from. However, because this guy was a real bully, he picked up a small rock and immediately threw it straight at this little dragon. Since the poor unfortunate creature was not even aware of such an incident, of course, it could not dodge, so the stone hit it straight in the body. As soon as Pearl saw this, she was very surprised. She did not understand why his body did not move, and immediately guessed that most likely it was the limitation stone. This little dragon began to fly down at great speed, and then she felt it was her duty to catch him so that he would not die. As soon as Pearl did this, she immediately saw how this little creature opened its eyes and looked at her with its beautiful blue eyes. She was silent for a while. Then she lifted the dragon up and, smiling, said that his eyes were simply amazing. She had never seen anything like them before. However, at that moment, her stepbrother came up to her again. He started to mock the girl and asked why she was so happy. The other children, who simply hated Pearl, surrounded her from all sides and said that she could not take care of herself, but found time to worry about others. Her stepsister told Johann that she had a great idea, and if anything went wrong, they could just blame it on Pearl and they would get away with it. At that moment, the girl came closer to her and, taking a knife from behind her back, suggested that the guy cut off this little creature's tail, and that would be their trophy. As soon as Pearl heard this, she was shocked. She immediately started screaming and begging them not to do this. Tears came to her eyes because she realized that there was no way she could protect this poor creature who had done nothing. But at that moment, her sister grabbed her by the hair and said that she really was like a slave who couldn't even be trusted with anything. After that, she wrapped her hand so tightly around her hair that she pushed, and Pearl simply could not hold on, she fell and dropped the poor creature from her hands. The girl hurt her forehead very badly, but she didn't care about the pain, because she was used to it, because this was not the first time it happened. In fact, she was not even able to protect such a tiny life that simply needed support and protection. Pearl began to reach out her hand to the dragon, but it was useless. At that moment, the girl thought for the first time about why she lived this life at all, and just as her emotions were getting stronger, purple waves started appearing around Pearl, and the children were very scared when they saw it. They immediately began to run in all directions because they understood that this would not lead to anything good, and even thought that this was a curse, about which there were so many rumors. But Pearl was indifferent. For a while she just lay there and cried, and at that moment her dream came to an end, and the girl finally opened her eyes. As soon as she did, she noticed that she was not alone in the bed. Next to her was a rather handsome young guy who had blonde hair and such beautiful blue eyes. His hand was on her waist, and seeing that she had opened her eyes, he immediately smiled happily and asked, had she finally woken up? She was horrified, did not understand what was happening, who this man was and why he was pestering her so brazenly. Then suddenly she looked more closely at his blue eyes, which reminded her of real precious stones. He also had long silver hair, just like the dragon that had captured her that day. But she didn't understand how that was even possible. She was acutely aware of the man's resemblance to the dragon that had attacked their carriage, and at that moment she knew that this man was a dragonborn. She knew perfectly well that she had to run, because nothing good would come of it. The guy was completely naked and was going to do something bad to her. She knew that perfectly well. Pearl managed to turn around with great effort. However, he was not going to lag behind her. He began to seduce the girl and touch the forbidden areas. She immediately screamed loudly and started crying again because she didn't want all this. Pearl knew perfectly well that this was the territory of the Dragon Clan, and she didn't know if there were any people there at all. This unknown man, moving closer to her and kissing her on the cheek, said that he actually did not allow her to leave. At that moment, the girl even thought that this dragon just wanted to eat her. And because of this, she became incredibly scared, because she did not intend to die so early. Due to the intense stress, Pearl passed out again because she couldn't handle it all, and her brain was used to reacting that way. She always blacked out when it came to the horrible things that were about to happen. The guy, when he saw this, was immediately very surprised. He looked at the tears running down her face, and for some time he just stood and admired her. But then he began to lick these tears with his tongue, and as soon as he felt their salty taste, he was very surprised. In fact, human tears had no taste whatsoever that he was used to, just that saltiness, and that was all. He was very disappointed by this. After all, they were even worse than sea creatures, although they could at least create pearls, and they were at least of some use in this regard. But he wasn't going to leave Pearl so quickly because he liked her, so he decided to forgive her for such a shortcoming. When he moved closer to her neck, namely to the place where her perfume was sprayed, he sniffed and noticed that she smelled quite fragrant. Then, the man put his hand in hers and decided to lie on top of her for a while. He was going to wait until she woke up and said her name, and then he could move on to the next one. The guy, while he was lying on Pearl, imagined how he would confess his feelings, and they would even get married. His name was Eric. He saw the girl's downright happy expression and how she said that she loved him too, and everything was fine with them. The man imagined how they would get married and find their true happiness. It was simply amazing for him, and he thought about it for quite a long time. But suddenly his dreams were interrupted by a knock on the door. When it opened, a guy entered the room. He asked the dragon for forgiveness for disturbing him. Eric didn't chase him away, but immediately told him to tell him why he came. He sat on the bed and was completely naked and didn't even cover himself with anything. The fair-haired man, whose name was Anthony, immediately turned away from him and, angry, asked why he was naked at all. Eric, approaching the window, said that he was a dragon, and dragons didn't need clothes at all, so he didn't understand all this complaint against him. Anthony continued to be angry and asked, "Didn't he bring a man to this place? And for people very important etiquette." The guy also said that it would be better for him to dress up in nice clothes and jewelry, like ordinary people do, so that he could be perceived normally. Eric was starting to get really angry about this. He immediately looked at the guy and asked, was that really all he wanted to tell him? But the man, looking around the room, replied that indeed no. Tata of the ogre tribe had come again, so he decided to report it to him. At that very moment, Eric, with one wave of his hand, was able to grab his weapon, which was lying quite far away, and with its help, he already changed his clothes. The man smiled happily and said that since that was the case, they could go, and then the dragons and other infantry immediately went in that direction to attack the ogres to see what they wanted. Eric, who was walking in front, immediately waved his hand forward, and turning to his assistants, said that all troops should get ready, because they might have to attack at any moment. After that, he swung his fist, activated his abilities, and directed them straight at these terrible creatures, who were not going to talk peacefully, but immediately began to attack. Pearl had already woken up by then. She had been standing by the window for most of the day because she couldn't even leave the room. She found that the creature was no longer everywhere, so she decided that now was the perfect opportunity to simply escape while it was gone. But as soon as she decided to do it, she heard a voice behind her. It was Eric. He was covered in blood, but at least he had clothes on. Seeing the girl sitting by the window, he immediately smiled and asked, "Has she finally woken up?" The girl also discovered that there was a small silver tail behind him, from which blood was also dripping. It was quite difficult to tell whose blood it was, but she assumed it was probably not his own. At that moment, Eric came closer to her, and turning her head towards his, asked her to say that she loved him. Pearl was very surprised when she heard this. She immediately began to remember her past, namely the moment when she first used her abilities. She was immediately taken to a rather dark place where she was ordered to wash herself. The girl was not even given hot water. The servants simply poured cold water from barrels on her and said that her curse had tainted the entire palace, so they simply had to take some measures. They, of course, called her a witch because they did not understand how she could have such abilities. And when people do not understand something, they are afraid. After this horrible shower, Pearl was simply locked in a room. All this happened, of course, because of the catastrophe that happened in the temple. The girl always behaved quietly, and while she was doing this, everyone else just said various nasty things and beat her with a whip. Well, when she caught fire again, and all her power flew out, they of course got scared and screamed, because they thought that she would kill them. Pearl didn't understand why this was happening, and she didn't know how to deal with it. But she was interrupted from her thoughts by Eric's voice, who turned to her and asked what she was thinking about. The girl, who had not heard anything because of her thoughts, immediately asked him again what he was saying. The man decided to repeat himself and asked her to say that she loved him, and as soon as Pearl heard this, she blushed with shame. She did not understand what this dragonborn was talking about, and how could she confess her love to him if she did not even know? But the man just stood there and looked at her with a rather cold gaze for a while, waiting for some kind of answer from her. Pearl assumed that if she said something wrong, he might even eat her, and she certainly didn't want that. As if seeing that she was afraid, Eric sighed heavily, said that so be it. He would give her some time, and suggested that they at least have a little snack first. He took her by the hand and immediately led her out of the room. The man had not even washed or changed his clothes. His entire uniform was still covered in blood. She had absolutely no idea what was going on and also doubted whether he was really going to take her to dinner. In fact, while she was locked in her house, no one even thought about the fact that she needed to eat at all. Severe hunger, malaise throughout the body. In the end, Pearl could not stand it any longer and ended up simply burning down the entire castle because she could not control these emotions. And the cook on duty, when she saw the girl, poured her a very large plate of soup and a lot of meat. She not found out her, and so she just treated Pearl like a normal person, not even knowing who brought this child. Then she, with tears in her eyes, began to eat this soup quite quickly because she was incredibly hungry. In fact, it was the best thing she had ever eaten in her life, so now that she had a dragon holding her hand, she didn't know what to expect. A hope was born in her soul that perhaps the person in front of her was not as scary as she assumed. Perhaps he wished her well. When they reached the kitchen, Eric took a piece of raw meat from the refrigerator. It even still had a lot of blood in it. He handed the food to the girl and said that she ate it because it was very tasty. Pearl, as soon as she saw this meat, with blood and water flowing down it, was very surprised. She didn't understand how she could eat raw meat, but at that moment Erica licked the hand that still had the remains of blood from that piece on it. Of course, this scared her very much, and she immediately thought about the fact that it could be human flesh. Even it seemed that like this way he threatens to her. At that moment, she lowered her head down and began to tremble with fear. The girl considered herself very stupid. She could not understand how she could expect any tenderness from a blood-drinking monster towards her. Pearl felt very sorry that she had ever hoped for that, and stood there for a moment, wondering what she had to do to avoid making him angry. Then she finally plucked up the courage to look him straight in the eye and ask him if he would let her cook the food herself. At least, she thought it was a good thing, since she would eventually be able to eat at least some human food before he killed her. Of course, Eric didn't object and said that she could do it, since raw meat didn't suit her. But he warned that he would be nearby the whole time and watch her every move. The girl was shaking all over with fear. She didn't know what to do, and tears were welling up in her eyes, even though she understood that she shouldn't show her weaknesses. Then the man came closer to her and suddenly began to hug her very tightly. He immediately noticed that she was shaking all over, and in a rather sweet voice asked why she was so afraid. Pearl didn't respond to this. She tried to remain calm and not anger him. Then Eric suddenly noticed that she was too thin and said that she needed to eat more, otherwise it would have a bad effect on her health. The girl herself took it as meaning that perhaps, in his opinion, she was not plump enough to be eaten and well fed. He continued to hug her for a while, but Pearl didn't even dare to move. She was incredibly scared and really wanted to just run away from this place. However, Eric suddenly moved down a little lower and sniffed her body again, because she smelled very nice in his opinion. At that moment, Pearl immediately began to remember herself as a little girl, who was always afraid of everything and could not stand up for herself. She understood that she had to fight at least for this unfortunate child. She clenched her hands, and at that moment her trembling finally stopped. The girl I was able, some kind of by miracle, calmed down. Eric himself noticed this and was a little surprised because he did not understand why she was so scared. He stood there for a while, continuing to hug her, and then he realized that the most important thing was that he had managed to calm her down. Several hours passed since then, and he finally backed away from Pearl, and she was able to cook dinner for the two of them. They gathered in the dining room, and the girl placed in front of him a piece of meat with an egg on it, and some vegetables next to it. Of course, the girl was a little worried, but she said with a trembling voice that everything was ready. She was afraid that he would not like it, and that he would kill her because of it. Eric studied the food for a moment, but then looked at her and noticed that she was indeed very afraid. Pearl, when she noticed that he was still sitting where she had placed the plate, was a little surprised. She did not understand why he did not leave, and even suggested that perhaps he wanted to try what she had cooked. At that very moment, she noticed how the man began to reach for the food with just his hand and did not even take the cutlery. This surprised her very much. She did not understand how he was going to take it with his hands, so she immediately lowered her head and took his hands. Pearl ran towards him so hard, because she did not want him to touch the food with his hand, that she even stumbled and fell a little. She stayed like that for a while, not realizing what she was doing. She could clearly feel how hot his hand was due to him being half dragon, and it made her very uncomfortable. Then she quickly removed her hands and did not explain anything. She even just very quietly asked for forgiveness for doing this. Pearl decided that it didn't matter at all. The most important thing now was to explain to him how to eat properly, since he really wanted to try what she had made. The girl took the spoon and handed it to him, telling him to eat with this cutlery. Then she thought that he probably didn't know how to use it and decided to scoop the food up with a spoon. And then, handing him the cutlery, she told him to open his mouth and try it. As soon as Eric saw what she was doing, he was really very surprised. However, he decided to listen to her anyway. The man opened his mouth and then tasted what she had prepared. He practically not chewed, just swallowed this one. I'm going. It was impossible to understand anything from his facial expression, so the girl asked him in an anxious voice how he liked the dish. Then Eric, smiling happily, said that it was really very tasty and he liked it. His eyes literally shone with pleasure that he felt when he tasted it. Once Pearl saw this sincere reaction, she did not expect that she could happily believe him, and then suddenly her hope was born again in her soul. The girl sincerely assumed that perhaps now she would not be killed. She scooped up some more of the dish on her spoon and asked if he wanted more. Eric immediately opened his mouth and said that of course he wanted it, and then some time passed and he ate the whole pot. The girl went to the kitchen and was about to wash it when she suddenly noticed that she had cooked a really big amount, but she couldn't even try a small piece of it because Eric had eaten it all. The man who had been following her everywhere immediately came closer to her and, putting his arms around her waist, asked, "Is it really all over?" Of course, Pearl was not used to such physical contact, and she always felt very uncomfortable when he touched her, and even more so when she realized that he was a dragon and could kill her at any moment. In a voice trembling slightly with horror, she said that it was all over, and also explained that she wanted to wash her own dishes and asked him to let her do it. However, Eric, pulling her waist closer to him and leaning her towards the table, told her not to worry about it at all. He turned the girl over so he could look into her eyes and said that now she should simply say that she loved him. As soon as Pearl heard this, she was again very surprised and asked him again what he meant. The man immediately thought about it at that moment and said that first he should have told her that he loved her, and then she would have said in response that she loved him. Pearl had a hard time listening to him at that moment, much less understanding him. She was simply afraid of this man. After all, he was really huge, and it was hard for her to understand what he was even talking about. When Eric finished his thoughts, he put his hands on her cheeks and said that he loved her very much. He did not call her a girl, but simply called her a person. At that moment, some voice inside Pearl immediately began to laugh and said that he certainly could not love her, because no one would ever love someone like her. Even such a dragon could not do it. Because of this, the girl's emotions began to burst out of her, and the two of them were engulfed in this same purple fog that constantly jumped out of her in various situations, and she simply could not control it. Anthony, who was at that moment in an outbuilding not far from the palace, immediately noticed that something strange was happening. The man ran out into the street, not understanding what was happening and why the magic circle in the castle suddenly activated, because there was no reason for this. The man immediately ran into the castle and saw that Eric was sitting opposite Pearl, whose dress was completely burned, and she herself did not even say a single word, but was simply trembling all over. The man immediately approached his commander and asked, "Does this divine power really belong to her?" Anthony also asked how it could be that she still couldn't control it, since his soul was originally able to do it, but then Eric suddenly interrupted him. The man sighed heavily and asked him to stop saying all this. After that, he stood up from his seat and did not even look at Pearl. As soon as the girl noticed this, she felt even worse. She looked at her hands that had done this and understood that this would definitely not end well. She assumed that, most likely, she would be executed this time for sure, because dragons certainly would not forgive such things. she immediately began to remember how everyone in the palace called her the cursed maiden of the court, and no one accepted her. Then Anthony suddenly turned to her and said that she should follow him, because in all the books he had read, that was exactly what was written. The girl, hearing this, was very surprised. She immediately looked at him, not understanding what he was saying. The guy immediately explained that Eric was the only heir of the dragon race, and the reason why he brought her to this place against the will of his people was quite natural in his opinion. As soon as Pearl heard all this, she thought about it and realized that he was really telling the truth. She began to get back on her feet and realized that instead of beating herself up, she had no other choice now. She had to act. So, completely ignoring the man who remained standing behind, she immediately ran out the door in search of Eric. Anthony smiled joyfully at that moment, and at that moment he mentally congratulated her, because now the girl had become a real daughter-in-law of the dragon. She was the first of its kind. Pearl ran through the corridors and completely ignored everything that was around her. But when she passed by a huge painting of Eric, she couldn't resist. The girl looked up and, seeing his portrait, she immediately remembered what the guy had said in the kitchen before she ran away. Anthony said that he truly loves the girl and wants to make her his bride, so she only needs to say 2 words. If she did this, then the man would be able to give her absolutely everything she wanted. Pearl paused for a moment and thought about why he was talking about loving her, why he felt these feelings for her. Because even her own parents didn't love her, she couldn't feel or understand that others could do this. Pearl knew that this love had come very suddenly, and there was no reason for her to believe in it. It all maybe be just game or false. But at that moment she decided to try her luck and finally found Eric, who was sitting in the corridor near the window and looking out at the street. The guy immediately felt it as soon as she came, and without even turning his head towards her, he said in a quiet voice that he really wanted to eat her. Hearing this, the girl was, of course, very surprised. But then Eric suddenly turned around and started shouting. He said that he had left, and she should have immediately followed him and not chatted in vain with Anthony. It really got to him that she didn't follow him right away, but just stood there and thought about what to do. He had hoped that she would run and confess her feelings to him. The girl didn't even know what to answer to this, so she simply turned to His Highness and said that she was very sorry. The man asked her to come over, and Pearl did so immediately. Then he grabbed her for waist and lifted up. Without taking his eyes off the girl, he said that if she wanted to know anything about him, she should ask directly. He not wants to. She was in effect through others' persons. After that, he put her back on the floor and told her to lie with him a little longer, because he really wanted to sleep. They moved into his bedroom, and Eric was able to sleep peacefully through the night. When morning came, and the sun began to shine into their room, Pearl was the first to wake up. The girl lay next to him and noticed how beautiful his face was in this sunlight. She put her hand on his cheek to push the hair out of his face and realized that he was the first one who, after being burned by the black flame, still dared to be near her. This had never happened in her life before. After all, when people saw her abilities, they immediately ran away screaming and tried to lock her away from themselves. And it was precisely because of this calm reaction of the man that her heart felt strange, perhaps even light. The girl turned to the other side and closed her eyes. Thanks to this, she was able to fall asleep again. Immediately after she fell asleep, the man woke up and saw that she was resting and not even reacting in any way. He removed his hand from where she was lying and noticed that she didn't care at all. The girl didn't react in any way, so he realized that she had fallen asleep quite soundly. Eric knew very well that it was very uncomfortable to hug her in these torn clothes, and so he felt very awkward about it. The man also suggested that this was most likely the dress she was going to wear to marry another man. He grabbed the dress and was about to put it away when he suddenly noticed that she was not even reacting to it. Pearl was so tired that she just rolled over onto her other side, and that burnt dress could barely cover her body, because it was quite short after it had burned a little. He realized that he would need to change her clothes urgently because she definitely couldn't continue to wear this dress. He began to undress her little by little and get rid of that old dress. Pearl didn't even notice all this for a while. She just lay there and continued sleeping. However, when the man began to put another dress on her, she did not understand why she felt so ticklish. And because of this, she had to wake up anyway. As soon as Eric saw this, he immediately smiled and said that he was very glad that she woke up, because he did not know how to put on her corset. At first, the girl did not quite understand what he was saying, because she was still very sleepy. But then she suddenly looked down and saw that she was now in a different outfit. Pearl sat up in bed very quickly. She immediately apologized and said that she just really wanted to sleep, so she couldn't help herself. Her eyes closed for a minute, and that's all. But at that moment, she suddenly felt how the dress began to simply fly off her, because the man did not put it on properly. He simply placed it on top. Pearl started to catch him and cover her body. She didn't understand why she was naked at all, and because of this she felt very ashamed, because she understood that Eric probably saw her without clothes. She immediately went down so that the man would not notice anything extra and asked for forgiveness, saying that something had happened to her clothes, and she did not understand what exactly. Eric didn't understand her strange reactions at all, and simply said that her old clothes were uncomfortable, so he just took them and tore them because she definitely couldn't walk like that anymore. Then he handed her the corset and asked how he should put it on. The man explained that he didn't even know what it was for, but he certainly couldn't put it on himself. Pearl immediately took the corset from him and said that she could do it herself. However, Eric was not going to give her everything so quickly, and so, pulling up the corset, he made it so that the girl could not stay on her feet and fell right onto his chest. This made her feel even more ashamed. She explained that this corset was underwear that was to be worn underneath the dress. At first, Eric didn't quite understand, but when he thought about it, he immediately guessed, smiling happily. He said that now everything was clear to him and asked how he could put it on her. At that very moment, Anthony's cry was heard from the corridor, turning to Eric and saying that he would count to 3 and then go out, because he was already tired of waiting for him. The man sighed heavily and did nothing for a while, but when the count was already running out, Pearl realized that a barely familiar man would come in and see her practically naked. The dragon managed to react faster. He ran to the door, and when he didn't ask what he was doing at all, the guy answered that he was thinking that he didn't need his mouth at all, and it would be possible to shut him up. Of course, his assistant was very angry about this, and he said that he just came to invite him to breakfast, and also added that he did not understand why the man reacted like that to all this. After that, he turned to his friend, relative, and asked why he was just standing there. And the guy explained that he wanted to live a little longer, so he was not going to interfere. Pearl, when she heard all this, immediately realized that he was fighting with this Anthony, so she decided to just take advantage of this wonderful moment and run away while they were busy with their own. But at that moment, a small flying elf appeared right before her eyes. He greeted the beautiful lady and said that he was very glad to meet her. Pearl, seeing this creature, was very surprised, and this elf replied that his name was Hutu, and he was a companion of His Highness Anthony. The girl was overjoyed, because for the first time in her life, she saw an elf in person and could not believe that it was really true. She also said that he looks just like her father described in his diary, and she is very happy to see it with her own eyes. Hutu, smiling happily, surrounded her and said that it was a great honor for him to earn her favor. He also added that he thinks that His Highness Eric will definitely do everything she wants. The elf also asked what Pearl wanted more than anything else in the world. It could be any wish, she just needed to say it. Then the girl seriously thought about what she wanted and realized that more than anything in the world she wanted to get home. However, she also wondered whether anyone was even waiting for her return, since her family and friends had simply given her away to some old man and weren't even worried about anything. At this point, the girl had already put on her underwear and began to put her dress back on. Hutu helped her do her hair, and when they reached another part of the castle, the girl thanked him for it and immediately asked where they were going. At this time, the one flying next to her said that he would escort her to the dining room, and their guest chef had already managed to prepare breakfast for her, so she should go there as soon as possible. All the men had already gathered in the dining room. Anthony was indignant at Eric and said that sometimes it seemed to him that in his eyes, they were no different from enemies. He also added that sooner or later, a man will be able to bite through their spine and then eat them. Rodney, turning to his commander, asked what about the man he had brought, and at that moment, looking to the side, he just happened to see Pearl, who was peeking out from behind the wall. He immediately stood up a little and, waving to her, said that he had said that she would come, so there was no need to doubt it. Then the girl had to step forward a little, and she could literally feel all those glances on her. Because of this, she was very confused. However, Eric, seeing her in this beautiful new dress, could not take his eyes off her. She was just magnificent. Reaching forward, he pulled the girl towards him, wrapping his arms around her waist, and said that she looked amazing, and began to shower her with various compliments. Pearl, of course, was a little surprised, but at that moment, the man, looking at her with a pitiful look, said that he was hungry and really wanted to eat what she would cook again. The girl was very happy to have the opportunity to not be near him for a while, so she ran into the kitchen and said that she would do everything right away. Anthony turned to Eric and said that despite the fact that he had successfully managed to learn the basics of etiquette, he still treated her too rudely, and she was still afraid of him. Rodney agreed with his friend and said that the guy was a real rude guy because he scared her so much that she ran away from them into the kitchen. Eric, of course, didn't like it when people said something like that about him, so he looked at him with anger in his eyes and asked, "Does he really want to be beaten up like his friend?" But the guy, bowing to him, immediately said that this was not so at all, and also asked him for mercy. After this, the dragon stood up and told them to listen carefully. The ogres had to be quiet for a while, so he was officially going to tell them some very important news. In an official voice, Eric said that he wanted to have a wedding with this girl, and Pearl, who by that time had not gone far, heard all this and was simply horrified. The girl certainly didn't expect such statements, and still hoped that she would be able to escape from this place. But now she realized that the man was too serious. Some time passed from that moment, and Pearl finally prepared everything. The men sat down at the table and immediately began to eat this food. Anthony immediately turned to his commander and asked him to tell him what was going on in his mind. He asked, "Does he really want to live a married life with this girl?" He also asked if the guy even understood how hard it was to live with an ordinary person, considering that he was a dragon and essentially stole her. As soon as Eric heard about married life, he was immediately very surprised and, thinking, asked what this meant at all, because he had never heard anything like that. Anthony immediately looked at him with contempt and did not understand how a man was going to get married if he did not even know such elementary things. Rodney himself was very angry about this and started yelling at him, asking how he could not know this, because he had to put in so much effort to bring this girl here and get engaged, and he does not know the basics. After that, he turned to his friend and, shouting in his ear, asked him if he believed in all this at all. B-Guy just is playing a prank there. By then, Pearl had come out and brought Eric's food on a tray. She said she was done so he could eat too. She looked very worried about what she heard before her cooking, and because of this, she didn't even hide her emotions. However, Eric suddenly took her hand and asked her to feed him the same way as yesterday. I liked it, that's why he wanted, would this repeat? As soon as Pearl heard this, she immediately became embarrassed, because she did not expect that he would ask her to do this. Rodney at this point took his friend, and they began to leave, saying that he was not even able to eat by himself, so it was better for them to leave them alone so that the girl would not be even more embarrassed about all this. When they came out, Pearl stabbed a piece of meat she had cooked with a fork and immediately began to hand it to the dragon. But when she had already brought the fork to her mouth, he grabbed her hand and also began to put it in his mouth. The people who were outside at that moment immediately began to whisper among themselves. Observing the situation, they noticed that this person was quite weak. They felt as if they could crush her with just one hand. Pearl herself noticed that there were too many dragons outside, and because of this, she was very scared, and her hands even trembled. Eric, seeing where she was looking all the time, looked in that direction as well. After that, he pulled her head aside and said in a gentle voice that she should not be afraid. He also smiled happily and said that he was there and would definitely protect her. And at that moment, the wing that grew from his back immediately began to cover them so that the dragons could no longer see. The girl was very surprised by this, but continued to feed him. In fact, she did not expect him to protect her. After the meal was finished, the man was the first to get up from the table and, taking her hand, said that since they had already eaten, he would like to take her somewhere. Pearl didn't answer but simply followed him. She herself was wondering who she was to him. He tells her not to be afraid and even protects her, gives her new clothes and feeds her well. So Pearl suggested that perhaps she is his personal food supply for some difficult day. At that moment, a smile began to appear on her face, and she thought that she must have just gone crazy because she thought it was very sweet and caring on his part. Then they came to a huge door that led into something completely unknown to Pearl, and she thought that she was not afraid at all, and that surprised her. Then suddenly Eric asked her to move away, and he touched the door. It was as if he used some of his abilities, and then the doors opened, and he, hugging her around the waist, protected her from the various fragments that flew in their direction. Pearl felt a strong cold and did not understand at all what kind of place it was. When she opened her eyes, she saw a rather spacious room with columns and even some flags. And Eric, when he saw that she herself had pressed herself against him, was very surprised, but in a pleasant sense of the word. He immediately thought that he was making progress in his behavior. Then he walked over to a small stand and placed a huge blue crystal on it. Around them straightaway appeared some transparent fog, and at that very moment, Pearl felt that she was no longer cold. This, of course, surprised her very much. Then she realized that she had pressed herself against him completely by accident, so she moved away. However, Eric moved closer to her and, hugging her around the waist, asked why she had moved away. The girl immediately answered in a trembling voice that she thought he didn't like it when someone was too close. But the man, turning her face closer to him, asked who was telling her that. At that moment, he opened his mouth slightly, and she could see his enormous fangs. At that moment, she realized that she had done it only because she was very scared, but now it became even more scary when she saw his teeth, with which he could bite her throat at any moment. Then suddenly, Eric heard some noise behind her and told her to stay where she was for now, because this place was safe and no dragon would dare enter without permission. After that, he started walking towards the exit and said that he needed to look somewhere else so she shouldn't worry. As long as she stayed in this room, she could feel completely safe. But at that moment, the eggs, which were standing on huge racks, immediately began to make some noise. Eric, smiling, told her to look because they really liked them. The girl was very surprised when she heard this. She immediately looked at all these colorful eggs and did not understand what they were. She could only assume that there were probably babies inside. And Eric said that the jug that was nearby was a liquid and asked her to anoint them with oil from it. There was no need to be careful. They didn't understand anything anyway, and this oil would be very useful for them. After that, Eric walked out the door and closed it behind him. And at that moment, he remembered the words of his assistant. who asked if he even understood how hard it was to live with a person. He also thought about this very unknown married life, because Anthony was not the first person to tell him about this, so he became very interested. The man remembered very well how this was mentioned in one book, this something more passionate and deep, and the so-called marital duty brings two hearts together, and they get incredible pleasure. The man could already calmly imagine this, and it made him even happier. However, when he thought back to Pearl's body, he realized that she was too thin, and he assumed that her body weight would most likely not support it. At that very moment, Pearl approached one of the eggs and, looking at it carefully, was very surprised, because she clearly saw how it began to move strangely. The egg stood still for a while, and then began to move so much that it almost fell off its stand.